Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome to today's seminar, Anthropocene Storytelling, Homecoming or Far From Home by David Farrier. My name is Dan Grimley. I'm the Head of Humanities here at Oxford, and I'm really thrilled to be part of this Oxford-Penn-Toronto partnership in the Environmental Humanities. And I'm especially grateful to be here at a time when very many of us, of course, are transfixed by the rolling news footage of the victims of Vladimir Putin's aggression in Ukraine and Russia. And of course, the victims of violence across the world in Myanmar, Yemen, South Sudan, and elsewhere. This is a difficult time for many people. And it's a time when perhaps the humanities might seem somehow peripheral or remote from everyday goings on in the world. But I think actually this is a time when humanities means more than ever before. And the need for intellectual engagement, for community, and for a coming together has never been more urgent or more compelling. I want to say just a few words about our partnership before I give David a full and proper introduction. We've been fortunate over the past few months to have been able to welcome four incredible speakers: Linda Thwaites-Smith, Kim Ruffin, Justin Hopi, and this evening, David Farrier. And we've used this series as an opportunity to investigate the themes and questions that we hope are going to guide our conversations in the future. All four thinkers have stimulated us in various ways, thinking and encouraging us to think about literary studies, anthropology, geography, and they've given generously of their time and their intellectual efforts to help us address an array of topics that are crucial to a deeper understanding of ecologies worldwide. And we're grateful to all of them for that gift. Our research collective, of course, is not settled, and we're actively seeking further partners well beyond our institutional trio in Penn, Toronto, and Oxford, who can help us explore the world well beyond our intellectual and academic walls. And we've been particularly animated in our discussions by pressing issues surrounding the relationship between institutional regimes and their logic of power to questions of environmental injustice. If environmental humanities attend to the histories and practices that have severed thought from place, cleaving culture so often from nature, how might these discussions serve as a training for future leaders in environmental humanities that can support practices that better institute productive, creative, respectful relations? And how can we bring critical university studies into fresh dialogues with discourses of environment and ecology? How can we engage with communities who work towards environmental justice in our local and our connected spaces? And how can a seminar series such as this, and more broadly a research cluster hosted by three institutions with long histories of colonial presence and injustice, do meaningful restorative and anti-colonial work? Those are questions, I think, which have preoccupied us all the way through our talks, and which I think we'll also address partly through David's talk today. So let me introduce our speaker, David Farrier. He's Professor of Literature and Environment at the University of Edinburgh and convener of the Edinburgh Environmental Humanities Network. He studied at the University of Leeds before being appointed at Edinburgh in 2010, before which he was lecturing postcolonial literature at the University of Leicester. He's held a Lever Hume Visiting Fellowship at the University of New South Wales and was advisor on the Edinburgh International Festival Deep Time in 2016. So he could not be in better hands for addressing some of those topics tonight. David's most recent books consider the new realities of the Anthropocene. In his Anthropocene Poetics, Deep Time, Sacrifice Zones, and Extinction of 2019, he confronts head-on Tim Clark's critique of the notion of cultural agency and what he terms the intellectual shortcut of the Anthropocene, and offers us instead a sustained analytical poetics of thick time, sacrifice zones, and kin-making. David's book is a brilliant, devastating, and revelatory interplay of scale, difference, intimacy, and distance. Life has always been geologic, he tells us, replanting our bodies and our imaginations firmly back in the earth and air that sustain us, but which we have done so much to poison, pollute, and erode. This is no mere topographic fantasy, but a new materiality of being, a plangent reminder of our human transience and of our lasting impact upon our planet. In the process, David offers this new way of thinking about our bodies, our ecologies, and our relations, from the plantation-scene poetics of industrial forestry in Scotland and the Malay Peninsula, to the factoryscapes of Rust Belt USA, the former Soviet Union, and West Lothian. Life insistently swerves toward life, he says, pointing us to the relationality of all things and the connectedness that links our actions, politics, and legacies. But in his chapter on jellyfish ontologies, he also invites us to think again about other forms of presence, of intangibility, and of the preciousness of human encounter. Are we all jellyfish now, I wonder? What is left behind of us, if not that greasy trace? But in his newest volume, Footprints in Search of Future Fossils from 2020, David asks precisely what evidence of present human societies will persist in the deep future. Footprints starts somewhere in the North Sea with the discovery of 850,000-year-old footprints on the beach at Haysborough in Norfolk, the remnant of human migration across a broad swathe of savanna-like plain called Doggerland, stretching from East Anglia to the Dutch coast, which was later inundated by the floodwaters of the end of the last ice age. And the book finishes on the moon with the famous photograph of Neil Armstrong's boot imprinted in the dusty regolith of the lunar surface, a mark that may last in its airless space for millions of years. In between, David takes us on a salutary tour of Ballardian future cityscapes in Shanghai Pudong, the Forth Road Bridge, Langdale axe heads in the National Museum of Scotland, and a nuclear waste disposal site at Onkalo in Finland. His study draws its ear closely to the slow violence of terrestrial landfill and geological process, plastic bottles, warming coral reefs, wailing ice sheets in Antarctica. Silence itself will be a signal, he says, absence another kind of trace. And in Footprints, David picks up and breaks apart the hardened clay of a new Pliocene and reveals the human fossils that lie within: a mobile phone case, microscopic specks of plastic dust, the irradiated fragment of a spent uranium fuel rod. So before I hand over the microphone to David, I want to just close with an excerpt from an article in the Washington Post published last year called "Our Greatest Libraries Are Melting Away." And the extract begins, "The story of the modern age is written into the ice. An increase in black carbon and fly ash, the residue from burning coal, marks the onset of the Industrial Revolution. A sudden surge in synthesized nitrogen dates the invention of the Haber-Bosch fertilizer process in 1914. Radionuclides inscribed the nuclear weapons tests in the 1950s. The shift from chlorofluorocarbons to hydrofluorocarbons at the end of the 1980s marks a change in environmental consciousness, but the massive acceleration in anthropogenic carbon since the 1990s indicates that there's still a long way to go. Even the pandemic will be recorded as global carbon emissions fell by 7% in 2020. Spending time in the Library of Ice reminds us that our history is bound up with that of the planet. As the library comes under ever-increasing risk, we should remember the fate of another great library. Legend tells us that the Library of Alexandria burned to the ground, but the truth is less spectacular. As the Roman Empire fell into decline, people simply neglected to protect and preserve the fragile papyrus manuscripts that were stored in the library. Gone with it were the greatest treasures of the ancient world, hundreds of years of civilization stories, memories, knowledge, and wisdom. The greatest library in history was lost to neglect. Unless we act now, the Library of Ice will meet the same fate. And David, that's a modest build-up, I think, to some of the issues that you wish to address this evening. Your lecture is going to last, I think, about an hour or so. We'll then have a short break, and then you've kindly agreed to lead a student seminar following on. So we are absolutely delighted that you're here today with us, and we look forward very much to your talk. So David, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. What an introduction. I was wondering who you were talking about for most of that, to be quite honest. And thank you, Maria and Nikki, as well, for organising this and setting it up. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all virtually. I call this talk, or this side of things, Anthropocene Storytelling, Homecoming or Far From Home, thinking that that would give me the opportunity for all kinds of, well, depending on your point of view, fun or quite hokey Spider-Man references. Unfortunately, one of the consequences of the past 10 days of industrial action is that I wasn't able to work those Spider-Man references in. So if anyone was here for Spider-Man, I'm sorry. I want to begin by sharing with you a short video clip, if I may. So. The first footage, taken in 2019, of the grounding line of Thwaites Glacier in Western Antarctica, where the immense wall of ice is pinned to the sea floor. Thwaites is an open flow metabolism. Thwaites is an 80-mile wide plug holding the entire West Antarctic ice sheet in place. The glacier has enough fresh water to raise global sea level by nearly 0.5 metre, but if the ice sheet behind it, which contains more than 3 million cubic metres of ice, is allowed to slide into the sea, it would add a further 3 metres to global sea level. Rolling Stone journalist Jeff Goodall coined the term Doomsday Glacier to describe its calamitous potential. In December last year, an international team of scientists concluded, after a 5-year study of Thwaites Glacier, that it could break up in as little as 5 years. Thwaites has been called the most important place for life on Earth right now, and for the next several centuries. But the video that we've just seen has little to say about this. The music soothes. The text on screen invites wonder at life's capacity to thrive in the most hostile environments. It seems more lunar than terrestrial, and in fact it is so remote that it may as well be on the moon. The nearest human habitation to Thwaites Glacier is the McMurdo Research Station, around 2,200 kilometres away. The grounding line itself lies beneath 2 kilometres of ice. The footage was captured by a remotely operated submersible, and the images celebrate another frontier crossed by technology and ingenuity, laying another corner of the world open to our gaze. Perhaps inevitably, with such an alien environment, our attention fixes on the remarkable appearance of the anemone, life even here, where no human eye has ever ventured. But this is a much livelier, more human scene than images can disclose. The West Antarctic ice sheet sits in a vast depression, in places 2.5 kilometres below sea level, with Thwaites' grounding line perched on the lip of the bowl. The glacier itself extends many miles out to sea, leaving its belly, its underside, to be washed by warm water that melts enough ice to push back the grounding line by several metres every day. What circulates in this footage then is perhaps the most characteristic human signature of the climate crisis: heat, what Andreas Malm calls the effluent of power. Like the warm water nibbling Thwaites, capital always eats, writes Malm. Whatever eats must also produce waste. Jason W. Moore observes that capitalism is an open flow metabolism, one that requires more and more cheap nature just to stay in place. Not just nature as input, but also nature as a waste frontier. But the framing of the video, not just the gentle piano, but the knowledge that this is a robotic eye, disembodied, able to go where no human could, disavows any sense of human presence. We are in this video, but we don't appear to ourselves. Now, I'm aware of the dangers, certainly the considerable work that any declaration of we does in flattening the culpability for climate catastrophe. It's important to speak of what capital does and its consequence for a living planet, a livable planet, rather than what humans are doing per se, so that we can identify capitalism as a system that is hostile to life. But I'd argue it's still important to embody capital where it acts in effect as our emissary. The same rhetorical move to speak of capitalism as the driver of the climate crisis rather than human action maintains the distance between us and the cavern opening up beneath Thwaites. The advantage of speaking of we in this instance is that it closes that gap somewhat. It transforms what might seem far from home into a kind of homecoming. We can turn to another short film to help us think about why it's so difficult to see ourselves in scenes like this one. What I'm about to show you is footage that was taken from the dashboard camera of a fire engine during the bushfires that scorched more than 18 million hectares of New South Wales in 2019 and 2020. Writing in the New York Times shortly after the video was posted on social media, Charles Homans reflected on how certain kinds of disaster footage can lead to a form of exposure fatigue. Too often, when presented with handheld, shaky, ground level recordings of climate disasters, people actively fleeing wildfire, for instance, viewers engage in a kind of risk discounting. He says the degree to which our sense that a risk is distant in space, or especially in time, affects consciously or otherwise our assumptions about its severity. The frontal lobe sees a handheld video and thinks, this is my future, or at least it's my children's. The amygdala sees it and thinks, I've seen this before. The camera's jittery motion immerses us in the scene. But overexposure to the grammar of Hollywood movies throws us out of it. The dashcam footage is different, however. It offers, Homans says, an impassive, impartial, and unmistakably inhuman gaze. Despite the fact that there is a fire crew behind the camera sheltering inside the truck, the scene appears emptied of human presence. For Homans, this is the disaster film that for once tells the truth about our world, that it is indifferent to our fate. But I think there's something more interesting going on here than this rather fatalistic reading allows. As with the Thwaites footage, the image of the wildfire asks us to consider how to read a scene where human presence is reduced to the byproducts of capitalist consumption. Climate change puts immense strain on the capacity of narrative to offer a cohesive perspective, a unity of space, time, and perception. Claire Colebrook writes that the experience of climate change reveals multiple and incongruent systems for which we do not have a point of view. We are at once thrown into a situation of urgent interconnectedness, aware that the smallest events contribute to global mutations, at the same time as we come up against a complex multiplicity of diverging forces and timelines that exceed any manageable point of view. For Colebrook, the camera eye, like those that record scenes of melting ice and raging wildfire, seduces us into forgetting that before there is an eye that acts as a camera or a window, there must have been something like an orientation or distance. The orientation we emit, of course, is our intimate connection to the excess carbon and heat that flows past the camera's unblinking eye. In the footage of both the glaciers and the wildfire's edge, we are at the same time too much present and not present at all. The dashcam doesn't reveal nature's indifference, but rather our own. The source of this indifference lies in what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, a seamless occupation of the horizons of the thinkable, summarized by the often quoted line of Frederick Jameson's, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." Capitalist realism, Fisher says, is a pervasive atmosphere, acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action. Capitalism provides an unyielding background or fixed horizon against which we meet the world in discrete packets of experience. Commodities are detached from their origin in natural resources. Time is reduced to the regular hours on the clock face. Disasters arrive without any trace of the histories that produced them. Social relations become atomized. In this context, Fisher says, environmental catastrophe features only as a kind of simulacra subsumed by capitalist realism. Val Plumwood's term for this process is backgrounding, positioning nature as the background to a dominant foreground sphere of achievement. Backgrounding is, amongst other things, a kind of de-narrativization, separating that which is relegated to the background from the skein of relations out of which narrative and with it agency, potential, and change is woven. However, a number of recent novels, works as diverse as Lucy Ellmann's Ducks Newburyport, Mohsin Hamid's How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, and Melissa Harrison's At Hawthorne Time, experiment with a kind of critical foregrounding. These interludes set aside any human presence in favour of a kind of ecological point of view. Harrison's novel often veers away from its protagonists to contemplate the ecological drama unfolding in a nearby hedgerow. Hamid shifts dramatically from the endeavours of its protagonist to succeed in the bottled water business to the draining aquifer beneath the city he lives in. And the stream of consciousness that occupies most of Ellmann's novel is periodically interrupted by short passages recounting the experiences of a female mountain lion who was eventually brought into captivity. What links these sections to the unnamed narrator to the central story is never made clear, but the effect is to challenge what we understand to lie behind connection between foreground and background, human and non-human, event and its absence. It's easy to write about places in a way that turns them into backgrounds and makes them inert, suggests Alexandra Kleeman, whose recent novel Something Under the Sun exemplifies this trend of critical foregrounding. The challenge, she says, is to show that there is a world that is bigger than the world of these characters. In Kleeman's LA Eco-Noir, the residents of drought-afflicted California submit to the corporate takeover of the water crisis while, in the background, an unstoppable wildfire burns. Water has been supplanted by a synthetic alternative, water, pronounced with a robotic downward intonation on the second syllable. Its market domination is total, with different brands for washing, cooking, drinking, and luxury consumption. But to Cassidy Carter, one of the novel's two protagonists, something is wrong with water. It has a taste, she says, or ominously less a flavour than the awareness of a presence, like the gag of your throat when you swallow a hair. Most disturbingly, water consumers are susceptible to a condition called ROAD, or random onset acute dementia, in which they lose all sense of time and place. The setup borrows heavily from the LA Noir of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, a sense of all-pervading criminality, implicating and afflicting every character in turn, hangs over the narrative, and in this sense, it presents a version of what Deborah Bird-Rose calls Anthropocene noir. But Kleeman is less interested in thinking about how genre can frame climate change than in the way narrative attention is organized. The waywardness of attention is evident in Kleeman's other protagonist, Patrick Hamlin, a New York writer whose memoir, Elsinore Place, is being made into a movie with Cassidy in a starring role. As a newcomer to California, he happily chugs water all day long and adopts the locals' indifference to living with wildfires that have no more hold on reality for him than the clogged red arteries in his navigation app that show where the fire has caused traffic congestion. Somewhere beyond view, the brush is burning in the bright daylight, orange scraps of flame dulled by the sunlight. The sound of small life fleeing from the fire, scurrying toward more fire elsewhere. Terrible, definitely, but it's not really an emergency, he thinks, putting on his signal and shifting into the fast lane, if you can drive around it. An emergency would have to be everywhere you looked, inescapable. Some long-submerged animal intelligence would recognize it with fierce instinct. In an emergency, the mind would not drift aimlessly from daydream to distraction as his did now in search of something to grasp. The emergency cannot be real if it lets us look away. Patrick instinctively resists the notion that something other than his attention might connect him to the world. Watching flying insects that flit through the beams of his headlights, he reflects that there's something awful about all that activity, the endless increase of creatures that live somehow, grow somehow, consuming even smaller bodies, unseen creatures to fuel their strange, fragile bodies. The reality of that world unsettles his own. But while Patrick resists the liveliness of the world beyond his immediate frame of attention, Kleeman's narrative embraces it. In a recent interview, she explained how the way a typical realist novel arranges attention, maintaining a proper and aesthetic proportion between what's relevant and what's in the background, can pacify the reader. Here's what's important. Here's the stuff that reminds you there's a whole world, so don't worry about it. She goes on, but recently I've been wondering about how the realist novel directs our attention to some other parts of reality, to some parts of reality and not others. Reality is this vastly entangled thing with billions of people, technology and climatic factors, non-human players that we never know, a million anthills that we will never ever write about, all these different things. And we cut this path through it that makes the world seem on the whole more stable and more tidy than I think that it is. And that tightness helps us focus in on the characters and feel for them in this intense, interlocked and involving fashion. But increasingly, I feel like the emotions that I have as a person supposedly living in reality have a lot to do with the outside, with the unexpectedness of things that I realize are going on, that unsettled my idea of what I should be paying attention to and what is going on in my life. It pushes into the frame. In Something Under the Sun, Clemens says she set out to write a novel where that foreground-background distinction kind of collapses. As the narrative progresses, it increasingly sets aside Patrick and Cassidy's investigation into water in favour of those climatic factors and non-human players that we never know. One passage leaves Patrick and Cassidy on the highway to explore the burning hills, where a female fire beetle looks for a place to lay her eggs, each of which will hatch a new beetle, built to sense the heat of faraway burning and to hurl its body in that direction. This episode acknowledges that capitalism is a kind of fire ecology, but it is not the only one on offer. Along with climate change, the Australian bushfires are a consequence of European-style agriculture and brush clearing to prevent the periodic controlled burning that Indigenous populations use to keep the land fertile. We might perhaps see ourselves ironically in the fire beetle hurling herself towards the flames, but Kleeman doesn't present this as a metaphor so much as a moment to look past the horizon of the thinkable imposed by capitalism. During Cassidy's visit to a clinic for sufferers of road, the narrative performs another shift in focus from ostensible foreground to background. 36 miles away, the phones ring in 7 different bedrooms of Cassidy Carter's 7-bedroom, 8-bathroom home, sitting unattended on its 1.3-acre lot, baking under the late afternoon sun. As the temperature climbs, the central cooling comes on automatically, pushing new-smelling air through shiny gold vents. In the 8 empty bathrooms, identical scented diffusers leak factory vetiver through oil-soaked reeds, saturating the room. After 10 minutes, the air shuts off. In the kitchen downstairs, an internet-linked refrigerator senses the rising interior temperature and whirs into action, loudly ejecting dozens of ice cubes into a holding tank. In Cassidy's automated home, a range of programs are designed to anticipate her every need. It is in effect a flat environment in which background space precisely meets the demands of the foregrounded body that inhabits it. In this sense, distance, the 36 miles between house and where Cassidy is at the moment, collapses. She is both there and not there. But Kleeman's background is also lively in its own right. The house, she says, is a half-living thing, multi-lunged and plushly organed, steeped in electricity and suspended in a continual sigh, the rhythm of its functions too massive, too slow for any real creature. Breathing out and never in, exhaling constantly into the world. Its metabolism is one of perpetual consumption, continually respiring carbon dioxide, Malm's effluent of power. A lot of work, it seems, goes into maintaining the background as background. The novel's camera eye goes on to uncover the systems and structures that do the work of maintaining the background as it explores the environment around the house. Out back, dark tufts of clover and nub nettles pull through the flagstones as the sprinkler starts up, broken, sputtering onto the dust. Wetness pools in the hollow around the fist-sized spigot, gathers and overflows, trickling into a cluster of dead and brittled roses. When the wind sweeps through, the sound is dry, dry against dry, the scraping edges of paper-thin and multiple expensive plants turned to tinder. Across the property line, the yellow brush grows thicker, thornier, and more wild. Gopher snakes slide smooth-bellied across the grasses, seeking warm living meat in the hidden burrows. Dull, palm-sized birds burst out and vanish again into the scrub. Every sound is a body moving through the world, a pair of eyes and small, trembling heart. The dust-coloured birds dart in and out of the sky. Something launches from the dirt road, a grasshopper with wings that fold invisibly back into the torpedo of its body. Past a sign marking the petroleum line running beneath, bramble gives way to live oaks with small, hard leaves nestled in the elbow of the canyon, where the water pools in the runoff. Reality, as Kleeman has said, is very much a vastly entangled thing here. Unlike Coleman's camera eye, however, which forgets its orientation to the world, Kleeman attends to relationship. Cassidy is present in the bush and valley just as she is present in her home, even while far away from it. Her presence disclosed by the drought that turns plants to tinder and the sign marking the subterranean petroleum pipeline. The full operation of Moore's Capitalocene metabolism from consumption to waste is here. The famous section of Time Passes section of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, in which the Ramsays' abandoned holiday home falls into disrepair, represents the protoform of this kind of critical foregrounding. As she was writing Time Passes, Woolf noted in her diary her ambition to render the background as foreground. I have an empty house, she wrote on the 30th of April 1926. No people's characters, the passage of time, all eyeless and featureless with nothing to cling to. What she seems to have had in mind is something like Colebrooke's camera eye. At the same time, Woolf also wrote an essay on the cinema in which she remarked that film allows us to see life as it is when we have no part in it. But what she writes is a scene teeming with work, of making and unmaking. Human presence, remembered only in the slumped shapes of some faded skirts and coats in wardrobes, cedes the foreground to the full range of natural labour, from sea air rusting the saucepans to swallows nesting in the drawing room and the untended trees and briars that make the whole room green. Until, that is, the housekeeper Mrs. McNabb arrives to set things in order, aligning the erasure of natural labour with that of domestic, coded as female labour, as equivalent forms of backgrounded work in Plumwood's formulation. As Colebrooke remarks, for there to be an eye that sees without a body, the camera that records the erosion of Thwaites, or the free-floating narrative perspective of Woolf's Time Passes, there must still be an underlying orientation. Critical foregrounding of the sort we find in Time Passes locates this orientation in what Deborah Bird-Rose calls the great planetary exercise in world-making that is rapidly giving way to a great unmaking. The world that sustains us through its vast labours has, of course, also sustained other earlier forms of life. To speak at all of natural labour is to suppose another kind of orientation to the deep time of the earth in which geological and evolutionary processes, all the work of making a living planet, unfold. This too underlies Kleeman's exploration of narrative and the relationship between background and foreground. For something new under the sun, the metaphor that grabbed me was plate tectonics, she says, the movement of rigid plates of stone across a substrate of shifting magma. The interaction between visible and obscured reality, and specifically the process of subduction, where two plates of earth collide and one sinks beneath the other, melting down to rejoin the Earth's liquid core. The way California's languor and ease sits atop a literal fault line seems like a perfect analogy for how we live, she goes on. We live at the intersection of different planes of catastrophe, each jostling for awareness. This is the work of critical foregrounding, to intervene in the space between that which is visible and that which is obscured, to frame the background processes that shape the world, and to bring home what seems so far away in space and in time. In Something New Under the Sun, another character, a pop culture philosopher nicknamed the Arm, reflects on the relationship between capital and deep time. I hypothesize, he says, that some people, a select but growing group, have evolved the ability to perceive money as a natural extension of their other sensory systems, the same way we perceive light via the photosensitive cells on the surface of the retina. To people like us, money is either an abstraction or something idiotically concrete, little rounds of metal, germ-ridden pieces of floppy paper worn down by passage from one hand to another, numbers on an ATM screen or a bank statement. But for them, it's real, present in a direct, non-metaphorical, non-symbolic incarnation. They encounter it as a physical thing in the world, like a piece of fruit hanging yay high above them, and they decide whether it's worth the trouble to reach up and pluck it. In the arms hypothesis, financialization, the market, and all the other apparatus of late capitalism are naturalized, one more expression of life's perpetual capacity to adapt and evolve. He goes on to make an analogy with an earlier phase in evolution, that of the end Permian extinction. That the end Permian extinction was due not to climate change or meteor strike, but instead to the evolution of sight. There's a kind of inversion of critical foregrounding going on here. Rather than draw capital to the foreground, uncovering its presence in the warm water flowing beneath Thwaites or the wildfires scorching California, in this reasoning, capital melts into the background. Any distinction between the current planetary ruptures and the deep past are flattened. The advantage enjoyed by the rentier class is no different to that which allowed a select group of predators to eradicate their blind prey 250 million years ago. It's all, for the arm, just the evolution of a new way of seeing. Kleeman's retort to this comes late in the novel. The final chapter begins with a bravura series of snapshots of deep time. First of the planet before the evolution of complex life, the thick sky lit by bursts of pink and green, the ocean empty to the eye if there were an eye to see it. Then the arrival of animals with no eyes and no ears and flower-like faces that hear with their bodies, each presence a touch. Finally, a strange fish leaves the safety of the single ocean like the white of an eye and struggles onto land to lay the eggs that incubate the first land-born creatures. These creatures then evolve spines and tough scales and endure until a rock from elsewhere blots out the sky, wiping them out and making way for the smaller furred creatures. The mammals stand upright. The stone comes to a devilish point. But where the arms vision figures the deep past as a prelude to the inevitable rise of capital, here the narrative warns against hubris. Even this new epoch is only a splinter lodged between long before and longer after. The next snapshot in this series zooms forward to the near present. A circle of townspeople, armed with shotguns and pitchforks, corral crop-eating pests into a killing circle. On a signal from the foreman, they take one step in, then another. Tighter and tighter the circle grows, until all the town could join hands and sing in unison, until the circumference breaks and folds in on itself like a collapsing star. The rabbits swarm at the center, a convergence of fear and roiling fur, climbing over one another to stay in place. In contrast with the arm's perspective on evolution, what we have here is a fundamental shift, where before the only rule is what lingers will linger, here organized labor seeks the eradication of a population in the name of productivity. By framing this scene in deep time, Kleeman casts a narrative perspective far beyond capitalist realism's horizon of the thinkable. Deep time, planetary time, is the background to all our lives, whether this is expressed through the slow process of evolution or the short-termist consumption of fossil fuels. But no longer the background to a dominant foreground sphere of achievement, as Plumwood puts it. Here, deep background, deep time becomes critical foreground. In an interview with Paris Review, Kleeman reflects on the role of literature in addressing the climate crisis. Let's say you have a novel set in the present day of Brooklyn, and there's no representation of gentrification or the gig economy or climate change. Can that be considered realism? Are you writing about an alternate reality, or are you simply telling an artificially narrow story that imagines a world in which these issues are not as visible and not exerting as much pressure on our psyche? In what ways do we need to reconcile how we build our standard issue reality in literature? In Something New Under the Sun, Kleeman offers an alternative to standard issue capitalist realism, where capitalist realism reproduces the same detached, atomized perspective, the same isolated camera eye on the crisis as background. Kleeman shows how the novel can cultivate a different perspective. Interposed in the space between what is visible and what is obscured, the task of Anthropocene Stories is to reveal how living under late capitalism allows us to inhabit times and spaces that seem very distant from our lived experience, but are in fact the most intimate homecoming. And if I have time, I just want to close by reading very briefly from my own effort in Footprints to reconceive how we address this issue of the background, how we might reconceive how we build our standard issue reality. It's from the chapter on plastics, which tells the story of a single plastic bottle that falls into the ocean somewhere near Shanghai, and follows its story as it interacts with the environment from there into the deep future. As it's caught in swift-flowing currents, the bottle enters the North Pacific Gyre, where it joins countless other pieces of plastic waste. Gradually, the bottle begins to break apart, and this is where we pick up its story. There are now too many pieces of the bottle to follow individually, perhaps too many even to count, so one piece will have to represent all the others. By now, the bottle has been in the water for more than 350 years. This particular fragment, no larger than a bead on a child's bracelet, drifts across the southern face of a vast seamount below the Hawaiian Ridge, which holds the Midway Islands above the waves, and into the path of a copepod, a tiny crustacean with a cyclops eye in the center of its head and long, branching antennae. Rapidly spinning its swimming legs, the copepod generates a miniature feeding current, drawing the microscopic dinoflagellates and plastic microfibers in the water towards its mouth. The current catches up the sliver of bottle, which sticks to one of the copepod's legs, along with dozens of plastic pellets and polystyrene beads gathered up by its frenzied activity. When the copepod dies, its intestinal tract sealed by a coil of blue nylon, smaller than an eyelash. Its body settles into a large cleft at the seamount's base and inters the last fragment of the plastic bottle in a rich deposit of thick mud and synthetic waste. Plastic debris is collected in this cleft for the past 400 years, encasing each fragment in an anoxic layer of sediment that will preserve it effectively for all time. Burrowing creatures will mix up the layers to some extent, leaving their own traced fossil paths, but not enough to prevent a deep seam of plastic from forming in the geological strata. After this, it is a familiar long story of heat, pressure, and time. Over the coming millennia, hydrocarbons leach from the fossil plastic, accumulating in small deposits and setting in motion a slow chemical return to the bottle's origins in the rich, dark material patiently accumulated in subterranean chambers so long ago beneath the Neo-Tethys Ocean. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.